This is part two of my series on power, in which I'll begin tracing its line of development from the fall of the Roman Empire to the present. I've divided the overview into four sections representing so many phases in power's development, each one corresponding to a more or less significant leap in the growth of government authority. I should also note that this is the story of Western civilization and wouldn't apply to the Eastern world, at least not in the same way. Basically, we're following the Spenglerian model that sees each civilization as a distinct organism with its own characteristics and aptitudes that determine its development. No two will look the same, so again, this is the story of the West only. And this story begins at the 5th century AD. I've labeled this phase descriptively as the transition from warrior to king, and it lasts until the 14th century. We start with the warrior band. It was the conquest of Rome by various barbarian groups that laid the foundation for Christendom. As you can see here, all those colored lines are invasions by Goths, Huns, Franks, Vandals, and others. And by the time they finished, they had appropriated what was once the Roman Empire and divided it amongst themselves as the spoils of conquest. When the dust settled, the functions of government were superimposed on the distribution of conquered lands, which itself mirrored the hierarchy of the clan. Chiefs and warriors would become the kings and dukes of European feudalism. However, at the same time this was happening, there was also a process of conversion going on, and this had the effect of, in a way, subordinating the rule of the barbarians to Christian doctrine. This was accomplished through the process of christening, which gave the rulers legitimacy both in the eyes of the church and in the eyes of the common people which they were to rule. This is essentially the first stage of what would become the divine right of kings, which has as its root principle the words of Paul to the Romans, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God." This is how the Pope, at the close of the 5th century, could say to the Emperor, "There are two powers, August Emperor, by which this world is chiefly ruled, namely the sacred authority of the priests and the royal power. Of these, that of the priests is the more weighty." This attitude persisted for quite some time, even to the 11th century, when it was said to King Henry of England, "Never forget it, Prince. You are the servant of the servants of God, and not their master. You are the protector and not the owner of your people." What is interesting about this attitude is that it is the opposite of what we've been taught to picture when we hear of the divine right of kings. In movies and in a lot of history books, this phrase is thrown around by kings in order to justify their whims and to excuse acts of tyranny and injustice. Basically, we've been given the impression that the divine right of kings was something thought up by kings in order to exercise unlimited power. That's not true, at least not yet, as you can plainly see from the quotes above. But another famous example of this is the crowning of Charlemagne. Everyone knows that Charlemagne was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Leo III, but what is telling about this is that Leo had to surprise him with it. Charlemagne, knowing that this kind of christening was not license but was in fact restraint, is reported to have said that if he had known what was going to happen that Christmas day, he never would have entered the church. The divine right of kings was a notion that did not empower rulers, but rather made them responsible to the Christian God. A christened king at least had to give the appearance that he was doing God's work, and that's quite a thing, even if it was sometimes just pretense. It was in this environment, then, that feudalism was established and would become the social order of the Middle Ages. The strength of feudalism is that it can provide vast territories with an underlying unity while allowing each group in the social network to remain as autonomous as possible. It did this by instituting a complex hierarchy that is loosely represented by this diagram. You can see the king at the top, who provides dukes with land in return for military aid from the dukes. The dukes provided the barons with land, and the barons provided the dukes with military service. And the same relationship existed at the next level between the knights and the barons, until you reach the peasants at the bottom. However, it's very important to note that the peasants did not render military service to their superiors. They represented the majority of the population, as you would expect, working the land and paying their superiors in goods and non-military services. In Catholic terminology, this arrangement exemplifies the principle of subsidiary function or subsidiarity. It states that the higher should not be allowed to absorb or dictate those activities which can be accomplished by groups of a lower order. There is a hierarchy, but each level is as autonomous as possible and only has dealings with the groups immediately adjacent to it. This means that the peasants owed nothing to the king, but only to their landlord, and even to him they did not owe military service. Nor did the king have the authority to make demands on any level beyond that of his barons. For example, there was no equivalent to the federal taxes we pay today to the central government. That's why the historian Will Durant could say that the state, in feudalism, is merely the king's estate. Now we can return to the two metrics I said we'd follow throughout this presentation, conscription and taxation. And also keep in mind that when I address these, I'm speaking from the point of view of the common man and not the landlord or the king, who represent minorities. So from the point of view of the commoner, what was there in terms of taxation? Well, as we saw above, the peasants owed dues in kind and non-military services to their lord in exchange for land and security. These dues always favored the peasant, and it was extremely difficult for the lord to raise them and get away with it. This is the advantage of legal structures based on custom as opposed to active legislative bodies whose sole function is to constantly modify the law. How much did the peasant pay? Obviously that varied from place to place, but Durant estimated that generally speaking the peasant paid less to his lord than the average American of the 40s paid in taxes to the government. I say the 40s because that's when Durant was doing his research. Now, how about conscription? The nobles and the knights were sworn in fealty to the king for campaigns of up to 40 days. Considering modes of transportation available, this is hardly anything at all, certainly nothing compared with campaigns modern governments engage in. Most importantly, this did not concern the peasants. Their obligation was limited to local militias, which meant service of a few days. Basically, this means that if their own village was being overrun, they had to try and stop it, which most of us would not even consider military service at all. So it's really safe to say that conscription did not exist. If the king wanted to wage long campaigns and get more troops, he had to pay out of his own pocket. This provided quite an incentive to limit conflicts as much as possible. So now the social order is firmly established around feudalism and the political hierarchy is in place from peasant to king, but the power of the king remains something like a first among equals arrangement. Anything he really wants to institute requires the assent of the other lords. The next leap comes when the king edges out his peers and becomes their superior in a more practical and absolute sense. And this is why the next period can be described as the transition from king to monarch and covers the 14th to the 18th centuries. I'll cover that in the next video.